I'm deeply honored to be here for a whole host of reasons. It's an interesting month, and I think it's an interesting month in terms of the way that we are viewing memory, the way that we are viewing heritage, and the way that we are doing what I call unremembering or re-remembering, as the case may be. And we're all aware that we just had to pass through what I've called in my previous writings an orgy of grief related to the 9/11 incident. And yet we have often ignored the many 9/11s and the many catastrophes and calamities and holocausts of our own context. So I think that September is an amazing month and an interesting month to remember ourselves. I'm going to take us through a brief paper which is going to talk about the historical context of socioeconomic power in this country and how then that links with the ongoing and present manifestations of social inequality. I will then speak briefly to a race discourse because it's impossible to speak about socio-economic or socio-political issues in this country without attaching or anchoring them in some sort of a race discourse. I will then speak about a word which has acquired a fluidity with which I'm extremely uncomfortable and which I would like to reclaim and which I would like us to reconstruct and reconfigure, which is reconciliation. And that is to do with the reconciliation of men and women, the reconciliation of our history, the past and the present, the reconciliation between truth and lies, and the reconciliation between what is now and what is to be. And I hope this is all in order. South Africa's historic transition, it is fraught with moments of audacious optimism, which are liberally interspersed with doses of increasingly articulated rage, desperation, and betrayal. And we see this every evening when we switch on the news. Now, there's a script which was written long before 1994, which was that the day that so-called democracy dawned in this country, a bright light was going to shine. There was going to be a cry of angels. There would be the sound of chariots. There would be some sort of orchestra and some sort of wonderful choirs welcoming and ushering us in to this bodacious new era of hope. And immediately we would see the disappearance of informal settlements. We would see that where there were shacks, there would suddenly be houses. Where there was darkness, there would be electrification. Where people had been walking to water, there would suddenly be pumps, taps appearing magically, mystically. Abracadabra, welcome 1994. Now what we have seen is clearly that the script has not gone according to plan. Where we are at the moment is that the particular 350 years of racial and economic domination, instead of becoming magically disappeared in 1994, have in fact become moving targets, amorphous, nebulous, and much more difficult to detect. All the more so because of the large-scale co-option of the growing black elite class. It's not even a middle class. The growing black elite class, and what we have seen is a retention of white capital under the guise of so-called black power or black rule. So it becomes a complex conundrum for us to address. And then we speak of a better life for all. And this story of post-apartheid South Africa was then again scripted to be a happy one, replete with sound bites and countless stories of how life had qualitatively and substantially improved for the majority of people. However, all we have seen is that there is a growing underclass and that there's a crisis of citizenship in this country. If we understand citizenship to be an issue related to entitlement, an issue related to be a construct related to belonging and ownership, ownership of discourse, ownership of narratives, ownership of catalytic self-agency, we can see that there's clearly a crisis in citizenship. The historical paradigm goes something like this. Person arrives, white people arrive, black people dispossessed and displaced from their own country. It's the same story which has actually happened across the world. It's the same story as the story of Aotearoa, now called New Zealand. It's the same story of Australia. It is the same story, a narrative that runs across both Latin and North America. The difference with the story of South Africa is that it has then been recasted and reframed as an issue of civil rights. Now, what we have seen in the last 100 years or so was then that the whole notion of race capital, race-based capital, was used to foment a sense of otherness and class division, even though it was not named as such at the time. And I give this context, and because it's part of an ongoing narrative in this paper, because I'm troubled by the ahistorical and anti-historical manner in which we address our race, class, and gender politics in this country today. Basically, what we then see from there is that there was a decimation and the institutionalized apartness and separateness of a whole group of people. We see then that there was the increased and deliberate, systematic, structural marginalization of an African majority in this country. Our movements were were restricted, and our movements were only linked to being fodder for capital and capital-intensive activity, whether it was in the mines, whether it was as cheap labor in cities, and even today in South Africa, across this country, our spatial planning bears testimony to the legacy of regulated and legislated movement. Now, when we then speak about social inequity, we then need to reconstruct and deconstruct the economics of apartheid. Apartheid did not die because of moral outrage. It did not only die because of the liberation struggles and the valiant attempts of people like Ndade Alexander, people like many other people in this room, Mrs. Moodley, Bradon, and other valiants. It also died because it was no longer economically viable. It was just no longer sexy. It was just not profitable anymore. And the whole construct of positive engagement and constructive engagement, which complicit apartheid collaborators, if I may say, such as Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Jacques Chirac, et al., had punted, was becoming too morally disgusting for white capital and for capital at large to be able to sustain. So then what do we get? We get a rebranding, and this is where the reconciliation part comes in. We get a rebranding of what was a hardcore anti-imperial struggle, rebranded as a apartheid and as a race issue. Now I beg and dare any one of us to ask whether any of our heroes and our sheroes spent one day in jail or spent one moment under house arrest or risked their lives because of the issue of trying to share a swimming pool or because of issues related to access to beaches. And I think that when we do so, we begin to reconstruct and really completely obliterate the truth of what was a struggle of access to resources, land, and self-determination. Now, okay. This is where then it is important for us, I believe, to begin to reconstruct our discourse on reconciliation. Reconciliation implies one of two things. It implies firstly that there was originally at some point a relationship of equilibrium, a relationship of parity, a relationship of mutual understanding, justice, respect, and honor. Perhaps when we speak of reconciliation relating to couples, a man and a woman are not getting along, they must be reconciled. Or two siblings have fought, they must be reconciled. Instead, in this country, we get a construct which implies that reconciliation is something that can happen even though basic historical elements and basic political and economic elements are completely ignored. one of the worst things, in my estimations, to ever happen to us was the manner in which the Truth and Reconciliation Committee did anything except to tell the truth and except to reconcile. What it did was to reconcile instead the interests of capital by failing to subpoena the big multinationals and the large global capital, which actually propped up and subsidized the apartheid regime for many, many years. And opened up a whole bunch of wounds which are bleeding to this day. And put a narrow monetary value, arbitrary, for a small group of people. I can't remember what the amount was, but it was petty and shameful. 7,000, yeah. I mean, give us a break. Give us a break. The cost of 350 years for 7,000 rands. Even Judas would have spat at that. Now, when we speak again about reconciliation in this context, it's important to then speak about reconciliation within the economy. One of the things at the time that Sampie Blanche was calling for, and other people, was saying that this should then evolve from the Truth Reconciliation and become the Truth Reconciliation and Justice Commission, which is a debate that many of us will have heard at the time. It was, of course, shot down because it just did not. It was deemed at the time that capital would be unhappy, that foreign direct investment would be averted, and that it would just spoil the script again of the new rainbow nation. This rainbow is pretty fuzzy. And I suppose it in one way or the other, it had to continue to be bleached and airbrushed in order to enable a comfort level to be reached for a minority at the expense of a majority discourse and of a majority truth and of a majority experience. Now, when we speak about reconciliation, it is then important then not only to speak about reconciliation between peoples, but reconciliation between the past and the present. The past is still with us. Our economic situation right now tells us that the past is still with us. One of the elements and one of the tenets of the last 17 years is that on average, the African majority in this country are 12 or 13% worse off than they were before 1994. And that minority population are on average a similar proportion, about 14 or 15% better off than they were before 1994. So, it's the old humdinger. The rich are richer, the poor are poorer, but that poverty in this country is racialized. Poverty in this country is also genderized. The majority of people in this country are black people, African people. And of those, the majority of poor people are African women. So poverty actually looks mainly like me. It mainly looks like the black woman. And yet we don't see a cohesive and coherent structural intervention which would bring women and African people away from the margins into the center of the economic narrative. Instead, we have put in place outliers and red herrings like BEE and BBEE, and we add B's and we add E's. And yet, in truth, the economy has not substantively transferred power, and it is not substantively changing complexion at all. Not at all. What we are doing is we are consolidating an oligarchy. Now, the uncomfortable part of this is that this oligarchy is linked very strongly to a political agenda, a political discourse. And worryingly enough, and like other countries which have gone down a very, very slippery slope in this regard, there is a growing intertwined relationship and interfacing relationship between the politics of party politics and the politics of financial power. And it is a very troubling trend indeed. When we speak as well about reconciliation, It is also important that we then begin to reconcile between the past, the present, in context of what was and what is now. The past is that Black people were marginalized in this country, economically, socially, educationally, and that it was legislated. The present is that the current regime seems to have some good intentions on paper, but has done substantively very little to be able to bring about a shift in these power dynamics and power relations. And this is really to do with the fact that there is the issue of citizenship has not yet been addressed sufficiently. We have signed up to several supranational agreements and several international agreements, and these were signed and negotiated long before 1994, ladies and gentlemen, and had absolutely nothing to do with what happened in April 1994, when many people in this room were standing, sweating in long queues and fainting and looking forward to the orchestra and the angels beckoning us into this bright new world. Okay? This is exactly to do with the protection of the status quo. And the unfortunate thing about this most is that we are typically unaware, uninformed, and these issues are obfuscated. One of the things that we should be aware of is that our country is in the grip at the moment of particular trade agreements at the World Trade Organization. I'm a bit of a WTO groupie, so to say. Not as much of an IMF groupie, but a groupie nonetheless on trade issues. And one of the things that is very troubling is that what these agreements do is they reduce our countries to basically facilitating states. And they reduce our states and our leaders to consultants, and their job is basically to hold the door open for unfettered market access to Western markets and Western interests. And it is for this reason that it is critical to reconcile the past and the present, and to understand that there is an ongoing narrative between the past and the present, because basically our resources and the core of the hegemony is still at a contested terrain. If we are able to then locate and relocate these discourses in a discourse and a narrative of truth, I do believe we'll be able to begin to get to the core of the issue. The outliers of B, B, E, etc., then also allow us to become distracted by the rather narrow acquisition of wealth of a rather narrow population of the society. This shouldn't surprise us. Nkrumah talked about the comprador class and the complicit comprador class. This is really unsurprising to any of us who are aware of what the prophets long told us and long warned us about. But then what do we do with these prophecies? How do we act on these prophecies? The dilemma of citizenship is also linked to the dilemma of trust, particularly in the South African context currently. The end of apartheid did not end racism, it did not end capitalism, it did not end gender violence and sexism, but the expectation was that these things would steadily lose power, diminish, and finally disappear. They have not died. Notions of entitlement have become a huge talking point, with any number of talk show radios reminding us that white identity is at stake, that white rights and white privilege are at stake, and accusing the African majority of wanting too much, wanting too soon, and of mismanaging and looting this country to death. And yet in all of this, trust in the state has been lost. Currently, we have a number of other outliers which I think are intended to distract us from the issues at hand. Issues around the conduct of the Youth League, for example, and a particular young man whose name I don't even want to call, because the oxygen of publicity is part of the cult of his phenomena. But we know who. And these outliers, I think, are part of dumbing down of the general political narrative in this country. They are part of the dumbing down and the removing from the issues that are actually of essence and of importance. And this is the level of the new politics that we are seeing in our country at the moment. Narrow national and party parochial politics, which other spaces and other forms of debate. We are in a space where it is a risky and a perilous undertaking to speak what the prophets like Biko and Sobukwe were speaking before their untimely deaths. It is perilous and it is dangerous to speak, to love your country and yet speak against some of the questionable judgments, some of the questionable appointments, and some of the questionable tender processes that we see headlining our news and our Sunday papers every single week. Now, how do we then reconcile these spaces? How do we reconcile the space for dissent, the space for constructive dissent, the space for constructive inclusion, the space to disagree without being branded as ultra this, ultra that, being branded as being counter-revolutionary and not knowing politics? How do we do this? And in the interest of this, we need to then claim back the state, comrades and friends. The state as the defender, the state as the protector, the state as a trustworthy vehicle of our common aspirations, and of our common value system. It is for us to define and redefine how we intend to relate to this state, how we intend to respond to homelessness, how we intend to respond to the growing voicelessness, even, of our democracy, such as it is. The voicelessness that we see becoming encroached by way of particular legislations which are threatening to take away our voice, by particular judgments which are threatening to take away our voice, by the appointment of people who may or may not take away our voice. The appointment of not one but two questionable police commissioners is one such example. There are more people dying now, more citizens and civilians dying now than there have been previously. Since 1994, the last few years, there's been a spike, an increase. We must ask ourselves, why? Tatani was not the only one. There are many Tatanis across this country. Why? And I see Tatani as a symbol, as a metaphor for the death of dissent, for the death of disagreement, for the death of popular discourse. And what next? Now, in this state of unreconciled reconciliation, we then speak about heritage and burn some meat and buy some coal and light a fire. And this is officiated by Ndade Arch, Obaba O Arch. Okay? So we're full circle. Because there he was officiating the TRC, and there he is officiating the death of history in this country, the death of viable political history in this country. When are we going to redeem our education system? When young ladies like this, what grade are you in? Grade 11. When young ladies like this are able to name all the African liberation heroes, when young ladies like this are able to name the trajectory of struggle, all the struggle moments, when people are able to name Buipato, able to name not only June 16th, but all the June 16th and the June 17th and the June 18th and the February the 10th for every fallen hero in this country. You know, children at my daughter's school, they come, they did a play of, and I was listening to this child, like, what's appetite? Appetite! Appetite! I was like, appetite? Who's that? Appetite is when I haven't eaten. Who is appetite? And this is the level of anti-memory. It's a humorous anecdote, but it's a devastating one. It's devastating. Children of 11, 12, they can't even spell it. They can't. They literally, I tried. I was like, spell it. She couldn't. They cannot spell apartheid. Let alone the way that our languages are being decimated. I turned down one place. I refused to send my children to a particular school because as I was addressing my daughter in my first language, the language of my ancestors, the language of my soil, Sesotho, they said, oh, so you speak Sotho to your daughter? Isn't she going to be confused? I said, I think you're the one who's confused. And I guess there are more schools down the road. Okay? So how do we then reconcile? Reconciliation without knowledge of self, knowledge of language, knowledge of history, understanding of the mechanics of the economy, and the machinations of the political, narrow political discourse, where outliers are diverting us from core issues. What next? I leave the question with us. Ke a leboha, maibuye.